In 1858, a tall, lanky man with sunken eyes stood before a crowd in Illinois. He had just lost again. His opponent, Stephen Douglas, had beaten him for the Senate seat. It was his 8th major political defeat. 8 times. He had reached for power, and 8 times. He had been rejected. His business had failed. His first love had died in his arms. He had suffered a nervous breakdown so severe that his friends hid his knives and guns, fearing he would take his own life. The world had written him off. But 2 years later, this same man would become the 16th President of the United States, lead his nation through its bloodiest war, and free 4 million enslaved people. His name was Abraham Lincoln. And this is his story. Section 1. Born into Nothing. February 12, 1809. In a tiny one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a baby was born to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. The cabin had no windows, no floor, just packed dirt beneath their feet. It measured barely 360 square feet, smaller than most modern living rooms. This was the world Abraham Lincoln was born into. Years later, when asked about his childhood, Lincoln would quote a famous poem, "The short and simple annals of the poor." That was all he would say. His father, Thomas, was a carpenter and farmer, hard-working but barely literate. He could sign his own name only because Lincoln's mother had taught him how, but Nancy Hanks Lincoln, she was different. Those who knew her described Nancy as superior to her husband, a woman with sharp intelligence, excellent memory, and a gentle yet strong personality. She taught young Abraham his letters, and more importantly, she taught him kindness. In 1816, when Abraham was just 7 years old, the family moved to the Indiana frontier. Thomas built another crude cabin in the wilderness. Life was harsh. Young Abe learned to swing an axe almost as soon as he could walk. But then, tragedy struck. In the autumn of 1818, a deadly disease swept through their small community. They called it milk sickness, a mysterious illness that came from drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous white snake root. First, the neighbors fell ill. Then Nancy went to help care for them. She caught the disease herself. On October 5th, 1818, Nancy Lincoln called her 2 children to her bedside. With her last breath, she urged them, "Be good to one another." She was 34 years old. Abraham was 9. His father built her coffin. Young Abraham was forced to whittle the wooden pegs that held it together, then help lower his own mother into the ground. Years later, Lincoln would say, "All that I am, or ever hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." At 9 years old, Abraham Lincoln had already learned that life could take everything from you in an instant, but he had no idea how much more he would lose. Section 2. The Education of a Poor Boy. After his mother's death, young Abraham and his older sister Sarah lived alone in that drafty cabin for nearly a year. A cabin with no floor, barely protected from the bitter Indiana winter. His biographer, William Herndon, later wrote that it was one of the most cheerless and dreary periods ever to fall to any child. Eventually, Thomas Lincoln remarried, a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought warmth back into that cold cabin, and something else. Books. Sarah Bush Lincoln saw something special in her stepson. While Thomas wanted Abraham to become a farmer, she encouraged him to read, to learn, to dream bigger. "Abe was the best boy I ever saw," she would later say. But formal education, that was a luxury the Lincoln family couldn't afford. By the time Abraham was 15, he had attended school for a total of 1 year. 1 year of formal education, scattered across different frontier schools that opened and closed with the seasons. But what Abraham lacked in schooling, he made up for in determination. He read everything he could get his hands on: the Bible, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare. He would walk miles just to borrow a book. His father sometimes scolded him for reading instead of doing farm work. "That boy," Thomas would say, "is sometimes lazy." But Abraham wasn't lazy. He was hungry. Hungry for knowledge. Hungry for something more than the back-breaking life of a frontier farmer. At age 22, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, remarkably tall for that era, Lincoln finally left his father's farm to seek his fortune. He had no money, no connections, no formal education, just an unshakable belief that someday his chance would come. Section 3. Failure begins. Lincoln arrived in New Salem, Illinois in 1831. It was a tiny village of about 100 people. But to young Abraham, it was a place of possibility. His first attempt at success came quickly. In 1832, at age 23, Lincoln and a partner opened a general store. It failed. The business collapsed, leaving Lincoln in crushing debt. When his partner died, Lincoln took on the entire debt himself, a burden that would take him nearly 17 years to pay off. Failure number 1. That same year, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. He finished 8th out of 13 candidates. Only the top 4 won seats. Failure number 2. But there was one bright spot that year. The Black Hawk War broke out, and Lincoln joined a volunteer militia company. His fellow soldiers elected him as their captain. Years later, Lincoln would say this election, being chosen by his peers to lead them, gave him more pleasure than any I have had since. It was a small taste of what could be if he didn't give up. In 1834, Lincoln ran again for the state legislature. This time, he won. At 25 years old, Abraham Lincoln entered politics. He began studying law on his own, borrowing books, reading by candlelight late into the night. Things were finally looking up, and then love walked into his life. Section 4. The Death of Love. Her name was Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of James Rutledge, the founder of New Salem. Witnesses described her as a bright, pretty young woman with flowing blonde hair and large blue eyes. Lincoln met her when he first arrived in town. She was 18. He was 22. And according to those who knew them, he fell deeply in love. In the summer of 1835, an epidemic of typhoid fever swept through the region. Anne fell ill. Lincoln visited her often as she lay sick in her family's cabin. A neighbor recalled, "It was very evident that he was much distressed." On August 25, 1835, Anne Rutledge died. She was 22 years old. What happened next would haunt Lincoln for the rest of his life. He collapsed into a severe depression. His friends became so worried that they took away his knives and guns. They feared he would take his own life. A neighbor named Mentor Graham later recalled that, "Lincoln told me that he felt like committing suicide often. The rain that fell after Anne's funeral seemed to break something inside him. He told people he couldn't bear the thought of rain falling on her grave." Years later, Lincoln confided to a friend, "I did honestly and truly love the girl and think often of her now." In 1836, Lincoln suffered what we would today call a nervous breakdown. His law partner, William Herndon, wrote that during this period, Lincoln neither ate nor slept, and his mind wandered from its throne. 3 years after Anne's death, Lincoln anonymously published a poem in a local newspaper. It was titled The Suicide Soliloquy. The opening line read, "Here, where the lonely hooting owl sends forth his midnight moans." This was Abraham Lincoln at his lowest point. 26 years old, bankrupt, heartbroken, suicidal. Any reasonable person would have given up. But Lincoln wasn't reasonable. He was relentless. Section 5. The political defeats. Slowly, painfully. Lincoln pulled himself back from the edge. He threw himself into his work. He became a successful lawyer. He got re-elected to the state legislature multiple times. He married Mary Todd in 1842 and started a family. But his ambitions were larger than Illinois. In 1843, Lincoln wanted to run for Congress. But for the sake of party unity, he stepped aside to let other candidates have their turn. Finally, in 1846, he got his chance and won a seat in the United States Congress. But his time in Washington was brief and controversial. He opposed the Mexican-American War, which was popular at the time. When his term ended in 1849, he didn't run again. He applied for the position of Commissioner of the General Land Office. Rejected. Another failure. Lincoln returned to Illinois, seemingly done with politics. He focused on his law practice, becoming one of the most successful lawyers in the state. But history had other plans. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This outraged Lincoln. He had always believed slavery was morally wrong. Now, it was threatening to spread across the nation. He returned to politics with a vengeance. In 1854, Lincoln ran for the U.S. Senate. He lost. In 1856, he sought the Republican nomination for vice president. He lost. Then came 1858, the year that would define everything. Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas, the most famous politician in America, for his Senate seat. They agreed to 7 debates across Illinois. Thousands gathered to watch these two men clash over the future of slavery and the soul of the nation. At the first debate in Ottawa, 12,000 people showed up. At Galesburg, nearly 18,000. Lincoln declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." When the votes were counted, Lincoln won the popular vote. But in those days, state legislatures chose senators, not voters. The legislature chose Douglas, 54 to 46, another defeat, his 8th major political loss. But something had changed. For the first time, the whole country knew the name Abraham Lincoln. Section 6. The Turning Point. The Lincoln-Douglas debates had been transcribed and published in newspapers across the nation. Lincoln edited them into a book that became a bestseller. Suddenly, this failed politician from Illinois was being talked about as a potential presidential candidate. But did Lincoln believe it? Did he think he had a chance? There's a quote attributed to Lincoln that captures his philosophy perfectly. "I will prepare, and someday my chance will come." And he did prepare. For years, through every failure, every rejection, every moment when the world told him he wasn't good enough. In February 1860, Lincoln traveled to New York City to deliver a speech at Cooper Union. This was his audition before the Eastern establishment, the power brokers who would decide the Republican nomination. He walked onto that stage looking awkward, wearing a new suit that didn't quite fit his lanky frame. But when he spoke, everything changed. For 90 minutes, he laid out his case against the expansion of slavery with logic, passion, and moral clarity. He ended with these words, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." The New York Tribune called it one of the most convincing political arguments ever made in this city. 4 months later, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Abraham Lincoln, the man who had lost 8 elections, gone bankrupt, and nearly taken his own life, was nominated for President of the United States. His chance had finally come. Section 7. President Lincoln. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote. He didn't receive a single electoral vote from the South, and before he could even take office, the nation began to tear itself apart. 7 Southern states seceded from the Union before his inauguration. 4 more would follow. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln, the man who couldn't win an election, now had to win a war. The early years were brutal. The Union suffered defeat after defeat. Casualties mounted. Lincoln was criticized by both sides. Too aggressive for some, not aggressive enough for others. But through it all, Lincoln kept his eye on something larger. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With a stroke of his pen, he declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. As he signed it, Lincoln said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The proclamation transformed the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about freedom. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would eventually fight for the Union and for their own liberation. In November 1864, with the war still raging, Lincoln won re-election. 5 months later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Union was preserved. 4 million enslaved people were free. Abraham Lincoln had done what no one thought possible. Section 8. Legacy. 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. He never left that theater alive. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The president died the following morning on April 15, 1865. He was 56 years old. A nation that had been divided wept together. Today, Abraham Lincoln is consistently ranked as one of the greatest presidents in American history, often the greatest. His face is carved into Mount Rushmore. His memorial stands in Washington, D.C. More than 18,000 books have been written about him, more than any other historical figure except Jesus Christ. But here's what matters most. Lincoln was not born great. He was not handed success. He failed more times than most people ever try. He lost his mother at 9. His first love died in his arms. He went bankrupt. He was rejected again and again and again. He struggled with depression so severe that his friends feared he would end his own life. And yet, he never stopped. He once said, "My great concern is not whether you have failed, but whether you are content with your failure." Lincoln was never content with failure. He kept preparing. He kept learning. He kept believing that someday his chance would come. And when it did, he was ready. So the next time you fail, the next time the world tells you you're not good enough, remember Abraham Lincoln. Remember the boy from the dirt floor cabin who became the great emancipator. Remember that every legend was once written off. I am a slow walker, but I never walk back. Abraham Lincoln. End. If Lincoln's story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. Every week we tell the stories of legends who were once written off. Who should we cover next? Drop a comment below.